Yeah, well, they tell you here that don't take any sickies. Try not to take too many holidays. What for? They're gone.
Got the word we've sacked on my birthday, 58.
The glimmer of hope is blowing out the wind. It's all gone.
Oakdale miners, 125 men.
Fair income has got to be this banker's trust. The managing director, Mr. Rob Fergus, is now going to receive one of the biggest payouts in corporate Australia. He's going to collect $24.7 million for what's called a change of control payment at the end of the week. The miners at Oakdale have been told to whistle for their sick leave.
Well, it's probably not much compensation to the Oakdale miners, but I think that they've effectively derailed any long-term plans Peter Reith had to lead the Liberal Party.
When we was first told that we were going to get the sack and got in the hands of administrator, absolute dead silence. You could have been in that hall and heard a pin drop. It was incredible. It was nobody could believe exactly what was going to go on.
When the mine closed, we were aware that none of our members had ever been retrenched without having had their entitlements paid. So we knew that we had to fight very hard. There had been many other high-profile instances where workers were retrenched and they didn't get their entitlements. Some got a portion, others got nothing at all. And we were determined to make sure that that wasn't going to happen in the coal mining industry. Straight away we set up a picket line so that no assets could be removed from the mine. The local lodge and district went into action. We called a national executive meeting and held delegates meetings around the country to make them aware of the issue and to make sure there was the necessary support for a campaign which could have been quite a long one. Our union has a very strong tradition of involving families in struggle, and this was something that had to be done at Oakdale right from the very start. We had meetings of the members at the Oakdale Lodge. We brought in their families. We straight away got clear the understanding that this was going to be a community-driven campaign.
What do we want out of Dumbia? We want our money! When do we want it? We want it now!
Following those delegates meetings, the National Executive straight away organised a major rally in Canberra.
500 angry miners have marched on Parliament House in Canberra, demanding that the federal government set up a special fund to help sacked coal workers.
Complete with pipe band, the frustrated and angry workers from all over Australia marched on Parliament to deliver a message to the government. The march sparked by the closure of the Oakdale colliery west of Wollongong. Workers are owed $6.3 million in entitlements. A similar situation occurred 18 months ago in Cobar and then the Woodlawn mine near Goulburn.
We won't lay down and we won't be beaten.
Workers' access to their long service leave is also under threat.
If Reith gets his way, that'll be gone and we're not going to let that happen.
Some of these miners have travelled down from central Queensland, 4 days back and forth in a bus for a 2-hour rally, and mostly they're just the union delegates. They say that if the government doesn't get the message this time, they'll be back with the workers next time, and that would mean shutting down Australia's coal industry.
There is not a working man or woman in this country who does not sympathise with you and identify with you.
The miners are demanding a long-term insurance fund to be set up to pay out the entitlements of any Australian worker who finds themselves in a similar situation.
A national insurance scheme for every worker in Australia has to happen, and it has to happen now.
They also want mining companies to place a 10-cent levy on every tonne of coal to provide for workers should the company go bust. Delegates this afternoon met with Industrial Relations Minister Peter Reith and Senator Nick Minchin. In Parliament, the Prime Minister passed the buck on to Labor.
The Labor Party had 13 years to fix this and didn't do so.
But miners lay the blame squarely at the government's feet.
This government abolished export coal prices in May 1997 and prices plummeted in the month after that by 30%.
And what was his words over Cobar? Yeah. We will make sure this never happens again to another Australian worker. And what's happened? It's happened to us again.
Late today, the Minister and the miners emerged from their talks. They'll meet again in 3 weeks.
We have certainly progressed the issue. It is a genuine issue. We are concerned about a system which is fair to employees.
My bloke's got the sack 4 weeks ago. I want them to do something, not 3 weeks' time. I want something done now to put bread and butter on the table for someone in blokes there who will be struggling by now.
At the rally we proposed a 10-cent levy to create an emergency fund, a very simple proposition.
That 10 cents on every tonne of coal mined in 1 year would pay for a fund of $22 million to pay for any company that went out backwards without paying its entitlement.
We put an option to the federal government, a second option, to follow on from our 10 cent per tonne levy option. The second option was that we access the coal industry employees' own monies through their long service leave fund.
We then got in contact with all the papers, from local to national. We got in contact with all the radio stations, all the TV stations, and they backed us 100%. We had absolutely superb coverage from everybody.
Whenever we rang somebody and said the media want to talk to you, can they come into your homes, the people were only too happy to open their doors, and they showed people where they had small children and they were paying $2,000 a month for mortgages, and those people were under a lot of pressure. I mean, you only have to look around the local area as well. There's a milk bar and a news agency in Oakdale itself that went straight on the market for sale, and I mean, they were the things that we wanted to highlight, the fact that once the mine closed, it was a domino effect.
By the time that we'd stoked the fires, the campaign really quickly took on a life of its own in the public eye, and as the whole community became certain that this was something that government should move on, and it was also certain that this was something the government didn't want to move on.
The plight of the Oakdale colliery workers has prompted calls today for national action. The 125 miners from the Southern Highlands are without jobs tonight after the gates closed for the last time. But they're still down more than $6 million in entitlements, and the fight is on to improve workplace laws.
The lift doors opened and it was over, the end of more than 40 years of coal mining at the Oakdale colliery. And the end too of these workers' plans for retirement, with no funds left for entitlements.
At the moment now, the only choice you've got is to go and get a job as quickly as possible.
At 56, Tom Geyer has worked at the colliery for 39 years. He says he's missed out on $97,000.
I most probably wake up again in the morning and say, oh, I've got to go to work, and there's no work. I don't know. It's going to be strange.
These men have spent the last few weeks hauling up machinery to raise entitlement funds. This equipment's likely to fetch about $1.5 million at a fire sale next month, but only $875,000 of that will go into the workers' pockets. That's the amount owed to the state government.
Before the Oakdale workers can get paid, others are well before them in the line. Oakdale's major creditors are reported to be the bank NM Rothschild, with a $7 million exposure, the bulk haulage company Heggies, said to be owed $5 million, the state government owed an unspecified amount in coal royalties, thought by the union to be $2 million, and then comes the 125 miners owed $6.3 million in severance entitlements.
One of the first meetings we had was with the New South Wales Labor government, where we requested the government to reassign their first secured charge in Oakdale over to the Oakdale workers by way of an employee trust which the union had set up on their behalf. The government immediately responded, and Premier Carr announced the assistance package at the ALP Country Conference.
It had promised the money to the miners when it was revealed there was no cash to pay them out. Now the Attorney-General wants the current laws tightened.
It's incumbent, I think, upon all of the states in the Commonwealth to improve the legal status of employees so that working people are better protected.
He also endorsed the UK model where employee entitlements are protected.
The money is paid out to the employee, the government then claims back against the estate of the insolvent company. Pretty straightforward.
And while this may be too late for the Oakdale employees, they'll fight on.
Our main concern now is getting legislation changed so this can't happen to anybody else.
It's just not for us, it is for all the people that work.
Apple juice.
Okay. What do you want, James?
Apple juice.
Apple juice?
Mark Dench worked as a miner at Oakdale for a decade. When Max Dumbier shut down the mine, the father of three was left without work and out of pocket. How much are you owed?
44,000, 42,000, something like that. And it's money that is owed to me. This is the thing, it is money that is holiday pay, sick pay, annual leave. It's money that they owe me that should have been paid up if I got the bullet.
Down the road, the home of Roy and Margaret Lamoon, like half a dozen others owned by mining families, is now up for sale.
I have been pretty down in the dumps. It doesn't take much to make me cry. My husband's away at the moment pushing the cause, so I'm missing him. And emotionally, no, I'm not very stable at the moment.
Spirits are down, and so is trade in the community which has served Oakdale. Anger, though, is on the rise.
The nation was moved by these pictures. 125 hard-working men thrown on the scrap heap, facing an uncertain future. But it's a modern-day tale. Companies run down by their owners who move on and start again somewhere else. It's that perceived injustice that sparked anger and sympathy.
Every worker in Australia deserves a fair go. That's all we're asking.
For 2 months, angry miners have hit the streets demanding the Howard government take action, compensation for the Oakdale miners and legislation to make sure it doesn't happen again.
At that meeting on the 22nd of June, we met senior cabinet ministers, we met Reith, the industrial minister, we met Minchin, the resources minister, and we met Fay, he's the finance minister and the local member for the Oakdale area. Now, they gave us a commitment that they would have an answer within 3 weeks by the middle of July, and they didn't keep that commitment.
Nick Minchin's off to America for 10 days with his wife. I think he'll meet John Howard, and I think they'll go and watch Australia play America in the Davis Cup quarter-final. I wonder what will be happening that weekend to the Oakdale miners. Peter Reith's off to Japan for 5 days. John Fay is going to London and to Scotland. These smug, self-centred individuals refusing to divulge their itinerary.
And there they are in summer climates on the other side of the world, while the Oakdale miners were salvaging equipment from a quickly flooding mine in the middle of winter in Australia. So the contrast couldn't have been more stark, and quite frankly, that's when the government lost the plot. That's when the public really did turn against this government and its values.
They told us a deliberate lie, and they done themselves an injustice, really, because when you had people like Alan James and John Laws and people like that started to come on board, because what we'd done all along was we'd tell the truth.
The delay in resolving the Oakdale mine fiasco can only result in the conclusion that when it comes to taking the big stick to the union movement, the federal government seems to act with urgency and high priority. But when it comes to repairing for workers the damage done to them by appalling employer behaviour, the government merely shifts and jabs and prevaricates, and as we saw yesterday, does nothing. This all happened at the beginning of June, yet there are miners at one place of employment, Oakdale in New South Wales, owed $6.3 million by an employer who just went belly up, took off and looked after his other business interests.
After that public reaction about them jetting off, Minister Hockey, Joe Hockey, the Minister for Financial Regulation, tried to take some heat out of the issue by making some announcements that Reith had already made in June. Those announcements were changes to the corporations law to make it easier to prosecute company directors. That was a shabby attempt to deflect criticism, justified criticism against this government, and it just didn't wash. The public didn't fall for that, we didn't fall for that. In fact, what we did immediately was to wheel out an advertising billboard truck.
Tony Marr is from the Miners' Union, the CFMEU. You said you're going to target Fay personally. What do you mean by that?
Well, we've hired an advertising billboard truck.
You've hired one?
Yeah, and it'll be camped outside Fay's electorate office for as long as it takes.
We went to John Fay's office every Friday because we knew he was going to be in there. The first time we went there, he was adamant, and he told her he wasn't coming to talk to us, but after a fair bit of talking, we parked the truck there and we got speakers on the side of the truck, and Trevor was on the speaker, and he came across the road and started to talk to us, and told us at the first stage that he was very concerned about our plight and very sympathetic, and we said, well, sympathy doesn't get our money, and he said he'd see what he could do, but I believe he was told to toe the party line.
First of all, we done all the local area, and then we went to Canberra twice when there were rallies, and then off to Melbourne and down to the Latrobe Valley, and everywhere we went, every little town we pulled up in, we handed out flyers and we told people about the Oakdale issue and how people, not just the Oakdale issue, but how people in Australia, whether it's the 17,000 people in Australia who have been sacked without their legal entitlements.
So the advertising billboard truck was a very important part of demonstrating to the government that the issue wasn't going to go away, the union wasn't going to go away, we were well organised, and we would put whatever resources into this dispute that were necessary.
In the end, everywhere we went with a truck, people would be honking their horns, and when we went to the rallies in Sydney, people recognised us straight away.
With the public outrage mounting, we were able to pin them down for a meeting on the 10th of August, the day after Parliament resumed.
To Canberra now, where sacked Oakdale coal miners received another blow yesterday, this time at the hands of the federal government. When you walked into that meeting yesterday, what were you hoping for?
We were hoping for a bit of a fair go, but we didn't get that. These workers have been ripped off by their employer to the tune of $6 million, and the federal government offered $200,000 in training and counselling. Now, $200,000 out of $6 million is an insult, so we've been ripped off and insulted.
Will the miners settle for anything less than full payment of the money they're entitled to?
Well, why should we? There's $240 million of our money, workers' entitlements, in our long service leave fund. We've been asking this government to cooperate with us, let us have some access to that fund, which would be a no cost to anybody. And they refused to do it. They dodged the question, and we're starting to wonder what they're doing with our money.
The only thing these miners got out of yesterday was a couple of $100,000 to assist them in the preparation of their resumes. A fat lot of good that'll do. Who's paying their mortgage? Who's paying their kids' school excursion fees? Let's face it, the meeting yesterday was itself hopelessly overdue. Ministers Reith and Fay and others should have been meeting with these blokes way back in June, but it was parliamentary recess. They couldn't find the time.
We called a National Executive meeting for the Thursday afternoon to consider our next step. We were flooded with calls for industrial action by lodges, by rank and file members. We were also inundated with calls of support from the community.
20,000 coal miners will walk off the job at midnight, angered by the plight of colleagues who've lost their jobs and entitlements. The 24-hour national strike follows the breakdown in talks this week between the sacked Oakdale miners and the federal government.
Anger over the federal government's refusal this week to provide financial assistance to the miners has now turned to direct action.
The National Executive decided that we'd exhausted all options. We'd been patient, we'd been reasonable, our rank and file had been very patient. The government had left us with no option. We had to take industrial action.
Thousands of miners across Australia have defied court orders to return to work after walking off the job at midnight.
Oakdale's 125 miners have been out of work now for 3 months, and the millions of dollars owed to them are still nowhere in sight. Today, thousands of Australian coal workers abandoned the pits in support, defying Supreme Court orders in 2 states to get back to work.
I don't want to see any interruption in the flow of Australian coal on the world markets. I mean, we survive as our biggest export, but the fact is the federal government's got to accept responsibility for allowing this to drift.
It's not fair to categorise the government's response as one of indifference. It's not indifferent, it's sympathetic, but I don't know that having a strike is helpful to the cause of the coal miners.
The union believes the only way to cut through the war of words is to continue the industrial action, and today it simply ignored court orders to return to work or to hearings in the Industrial Commission. Phone and fax lines were turned off and union officials made themselves unavailable. They say that's the only way they can drive home how the government's ignoring the issue.
This is one of Dunbeer's mines where the miners haven't been sacked. It's closed today by the national coal strike, which is costing the industry an estimated $30 million. That's several times more than the $6 million the Oakdale miners are owed.
And this is just a sort of bloody-minded attack for political purposes. It's not in any way taken as a constructive means of trying to deal with the issue.
In the eyes of the coal miners, Workplace Relations Minister Peter Reith is the villain in the piece. Earlier this week, the miners met the minister to put their solution to the problem. Simply take the $6.3 million owed to the Oakdale men out of a long service leave fund operated by the government.
A major victory for the Oakdale miners, sacked with millions owing to them. The federal government has backflipped and the miners will now be paid their leave entitlements.
I got a phone call about 10:30, 11 o'clock last night from District Vice President Spotty White, who told me that he'd been on the phone to John Fay and the government basically had done a big 360 and that they were going to pay our entitlements.
Are you surprised the Cabinet has now endorsed this one-off payment? I mean, as we said a week ago, you came away from a meeting that included Peter Reith, empty-handed.
It is an about-face, and the government is the last to fall into line about this issue. It's a just cause.
And our proposal about the long service leave fund was always a sensible proposal. Labor jumped on board, Democrats jumped on board, the community support has been tremendous, the media commentary has been very favourable, and it just goes to show that you can move governments. You know, the government shouldn't have given it to us much earlier than this, and let's hope that the government drops off its plans to abolish this long service leave fund, because that was the real reason they've been tardy in agreeing to this proposal, because they really wanted to carve up the fund and hand it back to mining companies.
Right.
So I'd call on Peter Reith to drop off that plan now that he's used the fund for a proper purpose, and so that it can't happen again in this industry, and to put in place a proper scheme for every Australian worker.
Oakdale miners spent the day celebrating their victory.
We're angry, we're loud, we're union and we're proud.
News that the federal government had agreed to use the coal industry's long service leave fund to reimburse the 125 retrenched miners caught many by surprise.
I didn't really expect it to come the way it did. Mind you, I'm real happy about it. Nearly drove off the road. It was, yeah, over the moon.
The Workplace Relations Minister today announced the new laws to allow the payment.
The government intends to use the existing long service leave fund, broaden that fund to ensure that these entitlements are paid.
They could have dealt with this ages ago, but it took a damaging coal strike, an expression of frustration by the workers, to finally get the government to allow the workers to access their own money.
120, been on all the way, I'd love to see you buy them.
And while the men's tools of trade were sold off behind them, the wives of the Oakdale miners weren't hiding their relief.
It just means a better life.
He's worked all his life, he's going to get his money.
Union officials shared the euphoria, telling the men of Oakdale that they've helped change the law.
You've done more than achieve your ends, you've set the platform for the whole country, because this government now has to move on entitlement protection for all workers. Our union...
Victory by the Oakdale miners will no doubt become the stuff of union folklore. The story of how 125 workers convinced an apparently hostile federal government to bend its own rules and find millions to pay lost entitlements.
What people have seen over the course of the last little while is a value in community solidarity, which is important, and a value also in trade unions, because it's the CFMEU, frankly, that's run this case on behalf of their members affected at Oakdale, and it's a timely reminder that workers need protection other than that which is provided by government.
If people now can't see why they should be in a union, then there must be something wrong with them, because if you're not in a union, you're not going to get nothing, and we've proven that. We've proven if you're in a good, strong union, like ours, the CFMEU, you'll win the battle. No risk in the world. And we've proven that point.
Without the efforts of the CFMEU, those 125 miners from the Oakdale colliery in New South Wales would probably never see any of the $6.3 million they were owed in entitlements after the mine was shut down. If you ever needed an argument that there is a place for unions to protect the rights of everyday Australians, all you had to do was look at the faces of the wives and kids of those former miners who now, at least in the short term, have been relieved of the terrible burden of financial insecurity.
Defends our rights, but our union's as strong as our will is to fight. For the union is you, and the union is me. So stand up and stand by our union.